Hello everyone, this is Mr. Seymour, and in this lesson we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, Political Parties. At first glance, it might seem that the American political parties exercise control over candidates running for their nominations, as is the case here, with Donald Trump displaying a signed pledge to support the party's eventual presidential nominee regardless of who it would be. But the reality is quite different. Trump won the nomination over the objections of many party leaders, and several of the candidates who lost to Trump repudiated their pledges by publicly refusing to support Trump in the general election. American political parties have three largely separate components. The party organization, represented here by Donna Brazil, interim chair of the Democratic National Committee, the party in government, represented by House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi of Democrat of California, and the House Minority Whip, Steny Hoyer, Democrat of Maryland, and the party in the Electorate, exemplified by the crowd at a rally for Hillary Clinton. So you have the party itself and its leadership component and its executive component. You have the party in government, which is how the party is integrated into the government, be it minority or majority. And then you have the party in the electorate, which is those that use the party to make decisions, party affiliation to make decisions on the basis of who they're going to vote for a primary or for a general election. What are political parties and where did they come from? Political parties are loose networks and not rigid hierarchies. The party in government is the elected politicians who belong to a party. The party in the electorate is citizens who identify with a political party. And the party organization is the party's leaders and workers. And political parties have one objective. The objective of a political party is to get their candidate elected. Write that down. The objective of a political party is to get their candidate elected. Parties were formed soon after the founding of American government. At different times, they looked and acted differently than today. The periods of stability in parties, their supporters, and issues are called party systems, and they go back all the way to the beginning of our government. Tammany Hall political machine, which is exhibited here in this picture, depicted here is a rotund version of one of its leaders, William Boss Tweed, who controlled New York City politics for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. His strategy was honest graft, rewarding party workers, contributors, and voters for their efforts to keep the machine's candidates in office. Now, the spoils system is the practice of rewarding party supporters with benefits like federal government positions. The party principle is the idea that a political party exists as an organization distinct from its elected officials as party leaders. There have been 6 party systems in the United States since 1789. The first party system was from 1789 to 1828, and that was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, with neither party really being dominant. The location of the key issues of this party system were: where was the capital going to be located, the location of the capital, and then financial issues. Should the government have a national bank? Should we have a national bank? Which we ended up with. The second party system, 1829 to 1856, was between Democrats and Whigs. And the key issues were about tariffs, farmers versus merchants, and the issue of slavery. The third party system between 1857 and 1896 was between Democrats and Republicans. Pre-Civil War slavery was an issue. Post-Civil War Reconstruction and industrialization versus agricultural versus a focus on agriculture in the South. In the North, it was the focus on industrialization. In the South, it was the focus on agriculture. The fourth party system from 1897 to 1932 was dominated by the Republicans. And this was a system that focused on industrialization and immigration, almost like what the Republicans are calling for today. The fifth party system from 1933 to 1968 was dominated by the Democrats. And then you had the Republicans. It dealt with the size and scope of federal government and the involvement of federal government in the daily lives of the states and their citizens. The sixth party system from 1969 to the present has been neither dominated by the Democrats or the Republicans. The issues involved have been the size and scope of federal government, civil rights, social issues, and foreign policy, with immigration now becoming a major focus as well. Debate over President Roosevelt's New Deal programs established the basic divide between Democrats and Republicans that continues to this day. In the main, Democrats favor a larger federal government that takes an active role in managing the economy, while Republicans prefer a smaller federal government and fewer programs and regulations. Now, realignment. Realignment is a change in one or more of the factors that define a party system, including the issues that divide supporters and candidates from each party, the nature and function of the party organizations, the composition of the party coalitions, and the specifics of government policy. Realignments occur naturally and typically within an election cycle or two, but they can occur gradually over the course of a decade or longer. When do realignments occur? New issues can cause realignments, but only if they are cross-cutting issues, meaning that they raise disagreements within a party or coalition or between political parties about what government should do. Historical examples of cross-cutting issues that led to realignments include slavery, the gold and silver standards, and civil rights. In the 1950s and 60s, parties were split on civil rights. Segregationists had allies in both the Democratic and Republican parties, and so did supporters of racial equality. Ultimately, the Democratic Party moved to support racial equality, and the segregationists shifted support from Democrat to Republican. There is speculation that the internal party divisions on the issues of free trade, cosmopolitanism, and immigration, which were uncovered during the 2016 presidential primaries, emphasized both by Bernie Sanders for the liberals and Donald Trump for the conservatives, may be sufficiently cross-cutting to trigger a realignment in the next session or two. Each party system is separated from the next one by a period of realignment. Realignment is identified by shifts in size or composition of party coalitions and shift in the nature of issues that divide the parties. And issues that trigger realignments are those that cause disagreements within party coalitions. We can see this happening both within the Democrats and the Republicans today. Now, party organizations. You have the formal organization, which is the National Committee, a party's principal organization comprised of party representatives from each state. State party organizations, which compose representatives of county, city, and town levels, and other allied groups such as PACs, 527 organizations, and labor unions and interest groups, who form a loose network of alliance with the major parties. These are best understood as a fluid structure rather than a rigid hierarchy. 527 organizations, which are named after the section of the tax code that governs them, are tax-exempt groups formed primarily to influence elections through voter mobilization efforts and issue ads that do not directly endorse or oppose a candidate. Political action committees, or PACs, are interest groups or divisions of interest groups that can raise money to contribute to campaigns or to spend on ads in support of candidates. The party's national committee seeks to reflect the party because the party's membership or base is the source of its power. Constituency groups like African Americans, Hispanics, senior citizens, and people with strong religious beliefs, women, and many other types make up each major party. PACs are strictly limited in the amount that they can receive from each of their donors and the expenditures that they can have on federal electioneering. Unlike PACs, 527 organizations are not subject to contribution limits and spending caps. The Tea Party, despite having party in its name, is closer to a 527 organization in that it is a loosely affiliated organization with a major party, but does not run candidates of its own. It is also important to underscore how limited the party organization is today in its stability and ability to influence elections. Not only can the National Party Organization not compel state organizations to do anything, it cannot force committee members to do anything at all. Former DNC Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz served at the pleasure of the committees, not the other way around. The Republican Party was unable to prevent Tea Party members from defeating its loyal supporters in congressional elections. Eric Counter, Representative Virginia, and Robert Bennett, Senator from Utah, were both victims of the party organization's inability to influence the election. So you have your formal organization, your national committee, which is the party's principal organization, and is comprised of party representatives from each state. State party organizations are composed of representatives at the county, city, and town levels. You have other allied groups such as PACs and 527 organizations and labor unions and interest groups that form loose networks of alliance with major parties, and these are best understood as fluid structures rather than rigid hierarchies. The Democratic Caucus and the Republican Conference are where co-partisans meet to resolve differences, coordinate strategy, and choose party leaders. The fact that the party leaders are elected by their party's members means that party members ultimately control their own fate. Current Speaker of the House Paul Ryan is unable to force his rank-and-file members to vote or act in a manner against their will. Despite popular perception, the parties are still ideologically diverse, and this diversity undermines the extent to which the party is sufficiently able to deliver its party platform goals. If members of the Republican Party, the GOP, do not want to address the issue of immigration, the party is unable to force the issue. And we've seen this now 3 times in the last few 90 days, 3 times in the last 90 days, with attempts to get health care passed for the Republicans. They haven't been able to do it. The party in government consists of elected officials that hold office as members of a party. They form caucuses and conferences. Within each House and Senate, within the House and Senate, party members work together to find areas of overlap and establish legislative priorities. They assign party leadership positions, and you have polarization and ideological diversity. Growing ideological differences between the parties are called polarization. Parties are composed of lots of ideologies and not uniformly liberal or conservative. Now, in terms of party ideology, over the last several decades, ideological differences between the Democrats and Republicans in Congress have increased sufficiently. However, even in the 114th House, both parties still included a wide range of views. In light of these data, would you expect more or less partisan conflict in the modern Congress than there was in the early 1950s? According to this data, you would expect House members in each party to agree on policies to pursue. But do they? Look at the Republican Party. Look at what has happened with health care. They can't get a bill passed. They haven't been able to get a major bill passed under President Trump at all. In terms of party ID, the parties have moved. Let's try this again. In terms of party ID, the parties have moved from rough parity in the late 1930s and 1940s to a period of Democratic advantage that lasted from 1950s to the 1980s. Beginning in 2003, Democrats appeared to be opening up another advantage. Although the change has eroded in recent years, what events might have caused these changes in party ID? And as you can see, you have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party fluctuating in identification. The impact of party ID on voting decisions in the 2016 presidential election showed that the majority of Democrats voted for Clinton, the majority of Republicans voted for Trump, and independents were split, with just a few more voting for Trump than for Clinton. Americans are much more likely to vote for candidates who share their party affiliation. What does the relationship tell us about the impact of campaign events, including speeches, debates, and gaffes, on voting decisions? The Republican-Democratic Party coalitions have different priorities on many issues, ranging from environmental protection to deficit reduction, and on a few issues their differences are small, such as reforming the tax system and reducing the influence of lobbyists. Do these differences make sense in light of each party's brand name? And that's something that you need to understand. Parties are like brands of cookies. If I go down the cookie aisle and I pick chocolate chip, and I see that I have Chips Ahoy, I know how it's going to taste, what it's going to look like, what it's going to smell like, everything, before I open the package, because I know what the packaging is. If I see Oreos, I know what Oreos taste like, look like, smell like, and I identify with what that Oreo is going to be. So when you vote by brand, by party identification, oftentimes you're voting on how that party stands on different issues. For instance, in dealing with global warming, there's a huge difference between how Republicans and Democrats see things. 15% of Republicans believe global warming is an important issue, a top priority, whereas 54% of Democrats do. On protecting the environment, 66% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans. On dealing with problems of the poor and needy, 70% of Democrats and 40% of Republicans, with a difference of 30. On improving the educational system, 77% of Democrats, 52% of Republicans. On supporting scientific research, 51% of Democrats, 35% or 33% of Republicans. On dealing with the role of money in politics, 51% of Democrats, 33% of Republicans. On improving roads, bridges, and transit, 52% of Democrats, 34% of Republicans. On addressing race relations, 62% of Democrats and 45% of Republicans. On dealing with the nation's energy problem, 51% of Democrats and 37% of Republicans. On reducing health care costs, 70% of Democrats, 64% of Republicans see this as a major issue, but they see approaching it in a different way. Making Medicare system sound, 58% of Republicans, 55% of Democrats. They don't disagree on that. Improving the job situation, 72% of Republicans, 72% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans. On dealing with global trade issues, 31% of Democrats, 29% of Republicans. On reducing crime, 64% of Democrats, 62% of Republicans. On reducing the influence of lobbyists, 42% of Democrats, 41% of Republicans. On strengthening the nation's economy, it's almost even, 74% Democrat, 75% Republican. Making Social Security sound, 62% Democrat, 65% Republican. Reforming the nation's tax system, 45% Democrat, 60% Republican. So now we're starting to get a Republicans agree more than do Democrats. Dealing with the issue of immigration, 45% of Democrats, 60% of Republicans. 71 defending country from terrorism, 71% Democrats, 87% Republicans believe this is a major issue. The primary issue. Dealing with moral breakdown in society, 42% of Democrats, 58% of Republicans. Reducing the budget deficit, 55% of Democrats, 72% of Republicans. And strengthening the U.S. military, 41% of Democrats and 71% of Republicans. Many groups, such as African Americans and white evangelicals, are much more likely to affiliate with one party than another. What are the implications of these differences for the positions taken by each party's candidates? So, if you see, if you're Mormon, you're more likely to be Republican, very less likely to be Democrat. If you're a white evangelical Protestant, you're more likely to be Republican, less likely to be Democrat. If you're a white Southerner, you're more likely to be Republican, less likely to be Democrat. If you're a white man with some college or less, you're more likely to be Republican, less likely to be Democrat. If you're white, you're more likely to be Republican, less likely to be Democrat. If you are in the silent generation, those from ages 69 to 86, 47% identify as Republican, 43% identify as Democrat. These are groups that tilt Republican. Now, groups that tilt Democrat: blacks, Asians, religiously unaffiliated, postgraduate women, women with postgraduate and or advanced degrees, Jewish, Hispanic, and the millennial generation between those of ages of 18 to 33, which unfortunately are less likely to vote than the silent generation of 69 to 86. Note that the Republican Party did not decide on a presidential candidate in 2016. Nonetheless, party endorsements have been strongly related to presidential primary results. Moreover, party support at lower levels is even more important. The party organization seeks to identify and train promising political candidates for higher office. For example, Joni Ernst and Cory Gardner both received ample support by party members before their elections to the Senate in 2014. State parties can determine for themselves exactly how candidates will be selected and which voters will participate. More detail on primaries and caucuses are in the next slide. So the role of parties in American politics is, number one, recruiting and nominating candidates. Party endorsements are a strong predictor of success in presidential primaries. But power to nominate ultimately lies with voters. So you have the primary election, which is the power to nominate, and that's where they're nominated, and the electoral caucus, which is also where candidates are nominated. Candidates are formally chosen at a nominating convention. So the primary elections are there to choose which candidate is going to be selected and endorsed by the party. Activist volunteers undertake most of the one-on-one efforts to mobilize support for a party and its candidates. Now here's some types of primaries and caucuses. A primary election is an election where voters choose the major party nominees for political office who subsequently compete in a general election. A closed primary is a primary election system in which only registered party members can vote in their party's primary. A nonpartisan primary is a primary election system in which candidates from both parties are listed on the same primary ballot. Following a nonpartisan primary, the two candidates who receive the most votes in the primary compete in the general election, even if they are from the same party. An open primary is a primary election system in which any registered voter can participate in either party's primary, regardless of the voter's party affiliation. A semi-closed primary is a primary election system where voters registered as past members or party members must vote in their party's primary, but registered independents can vote in either party's primary. In Texas, we have an open primary system. Now, a caucus election is a series of local meetings at which registered voters select a particular candidate's supporters as delegates who will vote for the candidate in a later state-level convention. In national elections, the state convention delegates select delegates from the to the National Convention. Caucuses are used in some states to select delegates to the majority parties' presidential nominating conventions. Some states' caucuses are open to members of any party, while others are closed. A caucus is a more one-on-one system. It's more participatory than a primary, which is more of an elections type system, a closed ballot. Both political parties organize a series of candidate debates during their presidential nomination contests, giving candidates a chance to present themselves before a national audience. Should the parties choose their candidates, or should the people directly vote? One of the most important ways parties help candidates is by raising money to fund campaigns. In 2012, the DNC raised nearly $1 billion to help re-elect President Obama and to support the Democratic candidates. The RNC raised a similar amount. In the 2015-2016 election cycle, party and leadership committees raised more than $1 billion in campaign funds. Although most of this money was raised by the national committees, the state, local, and candidate committees also raised significant sums. To what extent might these funds allow the national committees to force candidates to run on their party platform? That depends on how much national contribution the candidate gets. If the candidate runs more independently and is self-funded, then the national committee doesn't have a whole lot of say. While it is true that few people ever read party platforms and the candidates are not bound by them, there is general evidence that elected officials try to achieve the goals outlined in their platforms once in office. A party platform is a list of pledges and promises about what candidates from a party stand for and what they will fight for if elected. Candidates are not required to support the party platform, and many ignore key provisions of it, like pro-gun Democrats or pro-choice Republicans. So each part of the platform, each thing you stand on, is called a plank. And all of the planks of the platform form the platform, which is what you stand on. Parties don't exert total control over their members. Republican Party leaders could not stop then freshman Senator Ted Cruz from filibustering for over 23 hours in an attempt to stop a budget compromise. Parties do three things in government: agenda setting, which is deciding which issue the party will prioritize; coordinating, which is parties working together across branches of government; and providing accountability, which is giving voters identifiable groups to reward or punish for government action or inaction. Agenda setting can be a conflictual process in government, as co-partisans often differ on what issues they think are most important. Some Republicans would rather focus on immigration, while others emphasize the budget deficit, and still others prefer to focus on agricultural spending. Working together requires some politicians being willing to allow their pet projects to slide down the party's priority list. Parties serve as a bridge between branches of government, facilitating a more unified approach to governing by the parties. Members of the House, the Senate, and the White House must all work together to effect policy change. Parties help provide the initial linkage to help make this possible, which is why we call parties linkage institutions. Voters can use the parties as a shorthand tool for determining who to vote for in the fall. This is typically more easily achieved during unified government when one party is in control of all three branches. Parties do not facilitate as much accountability during divided government, as voters may not be able to determine which party is responsible for policy changes they like. and which party is responsible for those that they do not like. Minor parties typically do not have a lot of impact on national outcomes. You have Ralph Nader here, and he is an example of a time in the 2000 election. He was the one that acted as a spoiler and actually forced the conflict between presidential candidate Gore and presidential candidate Bush. Many of the Democrats blame Nader for Gore's losing the election. So minor parties oftentimes face institutional hurdles that are established by the major parties, and they do not succeed because of the electoral institutions that are established in the Constitution, although parties are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Minor party presidential candidates, such as Ralph Nader in 2000, sometimes attract considerably less press attention because of their distinctive, often extreme policy preferences, but they rarely affect election outcomes. Nader ran again as an independent in 2004 and 2008 and never got anywhere. In 2016, Representative Stephanie Murray, a Democrat of Florida, defeated 12-term Republican incumbent John Mica on the strength of a campaign that emphasized Mica's support for Donald Trump's views on women's health and gun policy. For the last 20 years, it seems as though all the news about political parties has been about conflict and stalemate. It seems as though political campaigns are increasingly negative, compromise on issues is rare, and the Republicans and Democrats have divided into camps that are never likely to agree on anything. Do you think this trend is new? What do the numbers say? The numbers say that we went through a period of polarization in the 1900s to the 1920s and 30s. Then in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even up to the early 80s, you had less of a difference, and then you had an increasing difference again starting in the 1990s going to today. All right, let's see how things work in theory. This is talking about how news makes it to the public. An editor assigns reporters to cover a particular story or event. And in filtering, the editor decides which stories are important and what will attract an audience. This is more from last week. The reporter gathers information and puts together a story. That's called framing. Reporter's story includes the overall argument and other information that shapes what the audience hears. Priming. By describing events using some words or phrases and omitting others, the reporter has additional influence on what the audience hears. The editor then revises a story through filtering, framing, and priming, and makes decisions about where, when, and how to carry the story, giving an additional opportunity for filtering. In addition, the editor can make changes to a story that involve framing and priming. Now, the media's coverage of Hillary Clinton's email server is a good example of filtering. It's not a story. Anyone who received a message from Clinton during her tenure as Secretary of State knew about her email practices and said this isn't a story. Until it is. But media coverage began only after conservative groups filed Freedom of Information Act requests to gain access to Clinton's emails. Framing. Some news stories focus on policies that require federal employees and appointees to use government email addresses for all official business. It's complicated. Others noted that this restriction was not in place at the time that Clinton was Secretary of State. Priming. She told secrets. Some news stories emphasize the fact that some of Clinton's emails contain classified or secret information. But it wasn't her fault, while others added that in all cases the information was not classified at the time that Clinton sent the messages. In the immediate aftermath of the FBI's decision to not bring charges against Clinton, news stories used sharply different combinations of filters and frames. One focused on FBI Director James Comey's logic for finding that Clinton's actions did not fit the standard for criminal activity, while the other emphasized that Comey's sharp criticism of Clinton's behavior was a factor in Clinton losing the election. And that's the end of this week's notes. I'm going to ask you to make sure you read Chapter 7 and go back and read Chapter 6 and look at filtering, framing, and priming.